I found myself unexpectedly sharing a bed with my nephew that night, a situation I never planned for, nor could have imagined. It all began quite innocently when I decided to visit my sister, Miriam, in her small, quiet town. It had been far too long since I last saw her and my nephew, Daniel, and I was looking forward to catching up. Miriam, always a busy woman with her work, had little time to visit, so I thought a few days together would give us both a chance to reconnect. The first night of my stay, after a long and tiring journey, I was completely drained. My body ached, my mind was foggy, and I couldn't wait to rest. Miriam, ever the gracious hostess, had prepared a wonderful dinner. The aroma of her cooking filled the air, and my stomach immediately responded with a loud growl. Despite my exhaustion, I sat down with Miriam at the table, grateful for the warmth of her home and the delicious food she had made. We shared stories over dinner, stories of the past few years. Miriam told me about her job, how her life had unfolded in the town, and the people she had met. I recounted my own adventures, tales of the places I had visited, and the unexpected events that had shaped my journey. There were lots of laughs as we traded memories, and it felt like no time had passed since we last spent time together. The evening was filled with a sense of familiarity and comfort, as though the years apart had been nothing more than a brief moment. As the evening drew on, the daylight faded, and the sounds of the world outside began to soften. The chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves slowly replaced the noise of our conversation. The room, once bright and lively, grew darker and quieter. My eyelids grew heavier, and the weight of the day's travels seemed to drag me down. A deep yawn escaped my lips, and Miriam smiled at me, her eyes full of understanding. "You look like you're about to fall asleep right here," she said with a chuckle. "Why don't you sleep in Daniel's room? He's at a friend's house for the night, so you can have the room all to yourself." First, I was taken aback. I hadn't expected to sleep in Daniel's room, but Miriam's offer was generous, and the thought of having a quiet, peaceful space to sleep in after such a long journey sounded perfect. "Are you sure?" I asked, wanting to make sure I wasn't putting her out in any way. "Of course. Daniel won't mind at all, and he'll be back tomorrow," Miriam replied warmly. "It'll be more peaceful for you too." Feeling both surprised and grateful for her hospitality, I thanked her and made my way to Daniel's room. It was small but cozy, with colorful blankets on the bed and a few scattered toys that gave it a childlike charm. The room had a peaceful atmosphere, a calmness that instantly made me feel at ease. I could already imagine myself lying down in the quiet, drifting off into a deep, uninterrupted sleep. Miriam helped me set up a mattress on the floor and made sure I was comfortable before wishing me good night. "Sleep well," she said, her voice gentle as she closed the door behind her. I didn't think much of the situation. It felt normal, even comforting, to sleep in Daniel's room. Miriam had ensured that I had everything I needed. The house was quiet, and the only sound I could hear was the soft rustling of the trees outside the window. The room was dark, but the quietness surrounding me wrapped me in a sense of security. I curled up on the soft mattress, and before long, I felt my eyes grow heavy, the weight of the day's exhaustion overtaking me. It had been years since I had slept in such a peaceful, serene place, and I found myself grateful for the rest. As I lay there, the gentle whispers of the wind outside seemed to lull me into a deeper state of relaxation. The room felt warm and inviting, but soon, I began to notice something strange. There was an odd feeling in the air, something not quite right, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The room, though small and cozy, suddenly felt colder than it should. A chill seemed to seep into the air, and the weight of the atmosphere made it feel almost oppressive. The air was thick, heavy, as though something was wrong, but I tried not to dwell on it. Maybe it was simply my tired mind playing tricks, I thought. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to dismiss the discomfort and focus on the soothing sounds of the night. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, that strange sensation lingered. It felt as if an invisible presence was hanging in the air, pressing down on me. I told myself to relax, to ignore it, but the unease wouldn't go away. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, my body too tired to fight the strange feelings any longer. Hours later, I was jolted awake. My heart raced as I opened my eyes, trying to adjust to the darkness of the room. The soft moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I blinked, confused for a moment. Where was I? What was happening? My breath caught in my throat as I saw Daniel standing next to me, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His small form was motionless, barely touching the floor, as if he were suspended in place. I froze, unable to move or speak. What was he doing here? Why was he standing so still, so close to me, in the dead of night? Was he sleepwalking? I wondered, though I wasn't sure. He had never done anything like this before. I opened my mouth to call out to him, but the words stuck in my throat. My body felt paralyzed, and I couldn't understand why. There we were, locked in this silent, eerie moment, his eyes never leaving mine. The stillness of the room seemed to stretch on forever. Time felt as though it had stopped. I wanted to speak, to ask him what was going on, but I couldn't. Finally, I whispered his name softly, Daniel, not wanting to startle him, but he didn't respond. His eyes remained wide and vacant, his expression unchanged. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then, without warning, Daniel moved. It was so sudden that I barely had time to process it. Slowly, deliberately, he climbed onto the bed beside me, his small feet barely making a sound as they touched the sheets. He pulled the covers over himself, curling up beside me as though it was the most natural thing in the world. His warmth pressed against me, and the soft rustling of the blanket filled the silence. I was stunned. This wasn't normal behavior, even for a child sleepwalking. Why was he here? Why wasn't he in his own bed? It felt like everything I knew had been turned upside down in that moment. I felt a wave of confusion and uncertainty wash over me. My mind raced, but I couldn't find any answers. I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to ask him what was going on, to figure out why he was acting this way. But another part of me didn't want to disturb him. Perhaps he was having a bad dream, or maybe he was simply confused. I didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable or embarrassed. In the end, I lay there in silence, unsure of what to do or say, as my nephew curled up beside me in the dark, the strange feeling in the room still lingering. Maybe he was sleepwalking. I thought again, trying to make sense of the situation. That would explain his strange, almost mechanical behavior, but something still felt off. The room was eerily still, and the air felt thick once more, like it was pressing down on me. It was as if the atmosphere itself had become heavy, laden with an uncomfortable weight. I lay there, in the darkness, unsure of what to do next. I could hear his soft breathing beside me, rhythmic and steady, quiet reminder that he was there. But even with that comforting sound, his presence felt so unusual that it made my heart race. It was as if I could sense something was wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The anxiety in my chest wouldn't ease. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself, it was just a fleeting moment of unease. I longed to ask him if he was okay, to check if he was truly asleep or if something was amiss. But I hesitated, frozen in indecision. Instead of speaking, I stayed quiet, unsure of how to approach the situation. I let him settle next to me, even though something about the whole situation didn't feel right. The warmth of the blankets wrapped around us, but instead of offering the comfort it usually did, it felt distant and strange, like it was suffocating me instead of soothing me. My mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of the strange tension that seemed to have settled over the room. I turned my head to glance at him again, my eyes tracing his still form in the dim light. He hadn't moved. His eyes were closed, his expression soft and peaceful, and I could hear his slow, steady breathing as he drifted back into sleep. Everything seemed calm, almost too calm. It didn't make sense. I stayed awake for what felt like an eternity, listening to the quiet sounds of the night. Yet the feeling of unease continued to gnaw at me from within, like an insistent ache I couldn't ignore. There was something fundamentally off, something I couldn't fully grasp, but it was there, deep in the pit of my stomach. Something was wrong. though I couldn't understand what it was. I couldn't help but wonder why he was so calm. Why didn't he speak? Why wasn't he reacting to anything? Was he really asleep? Or was something else at play here? My thoughts raced faster than I could keep up with, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was just a one-off occurrence, something that would pass with the night. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The unease continued to grow, wrapping itself around me tighter with every passing moment. The next morning, I woke up to find that Daniel was no longer in the room. I assumed he had gone to school or was spending time with Miriam, so I didn't think much of it. I didn't bring up the strange events from the night before, convincing myself it had just been a temporary lapse in his sleep, an odd but harmless occurrence. Yet, as evening fell, and I settled back into the room, something caught my attention. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, as if someone had been in and out during the day. I dismissed it, telling myself it was nothing more than a coincidence. But the seed of discomfort had already been planted, and it began to grow again. That night, as darkness fell once more, I found myself in the same room, lying on the mattress, trying to drift off to sleep, but the feeling of being watched, of not being truly alone, was overwhelming. It was as if someone or something was in the room with me, even though I knew I was by myself. My pulse quickened, and my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Then, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible creak. It sounded like the door opening, just a little. I held my breath, the silence surrounding me pressing against my chest. Was it Daniel again? My heart began to beat faster, my body frozen in place, unsure of whether to move or stay still. I couldn't bring myself to look. I remained silent, hoping the noise would fade away, but it didn't. The sound grew louder, like someone was moving closer. My breath caught in my throat as the weight of what was happening started to sink in. And then, I felt it, the unmistakable weight of someone sitting on the mattress beside me. My heart stopped. I didn't turn to face him. I couldn't. My body felt like it had turned to stone, paralyzed by fear and confusion. It was Daniel again, but it wasn't like before. Something was different. Why was he coming into my room in the middle of the night? What was going on? I had no answers, only a growing sense of dread that filled the room with its suffocating presence. His presence beside me felt like a heavy burden, even though he wasn't saying a word. The room was so still. It was as if time itself had frozen. His breathing, slow and steady, filled the space between us, creating a rhythm that felt unnatural in its calmness. It was the calm before a storm, the silence before chaos. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting to happen. But what? Was he waiting for something? Or was it me? Time seemed to stretch on forever, each second stretching out into eternity, each one heavier than the last. I stared up at the dark ceiling, trying to calm my racing mind, but the tension in the air made it almost impossible to relax. My thoughts spiraled, desperate to find an explanation, to make sense of the confusion and fear that gripped me. Nothing felt right. Why was he there? What did he want? Why couldn't I speak? I felt trapped, caught in a moment I didn't understand, unable to move or even ask the questions that burned in my mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I mustered up enough courage to break the silence. My voice was barely a whisper, hardly audible in the oppressive quiet of the room. "Daniel, what's going on?" The words slipped out before I could even process them. It was the only thing I could think to say. But as soon as they left my lips, I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The silence that followed was deafening. No response. I tried again, my voice trembling slightly. "Daniel." But there was still no answer. Just the slow, rhythmic sound of his breathing beside me. This time, I called out even louder. "Daniel, why are you here?" My voice shook with a mix of fear and confusion, but there was still no answer. Felt as if he was in some kind of trance, completely unaware of what was happening around him, completely disconnected from reality. It was almost as if he wasn't even there. I waited, hoping for a response, but none came. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, I could no longer bear the tension. I turned to face him, my eyes wide with dread, hoping to find some sign of recognition or clarity in his gaze. But when I looked at him, I was stunned by what I saw. His eyes were shut. His face was devoid of any expression, and he was seated beside me. There was something unsettling about his stillness, the way he sat so rigidly, his hand resting lightly on my arm as if it belonged there. I couldn't fathom what was happening. Was he sleepwalking again? Or was there something far more sinister at play? My thoughts were a whirlwind, racing with questions that had no answers. The next few days blurred together in a haze of confusion. I couldn't bring myself to talk about what had happened. I didn't know how to approach it, how to voice the terror I felt. Every time I tried to push it from my mind, the unease crept back in, sinking its claws deep. At night, as I tried to sleep, I felt a constant knot of anxiety. The silence of Daniel's room had become a heavy, suffocating presence. What if he came in again? What if I couldn't wake him up this time? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. In an attempt to escape my growing dread, I decided to sleep in another room. But Miriam, ever so practical, insisted I stay in Daniel's room. "It's just easier," she said, her tone casual, as though there was no real reason to worry. "He won't mind." Despite my hesitations, I found myself obeying, retreating into the room where so much had already happened. Each night, I lay there, hoping nothing strange would occur. But every night, something did. As the days went by, the incidents became more frequent. I began to notice little things, things that didn't make sense. Daniel would leave his shoes in the middle of the floor, his school books scattered carelessly across the room. But the most bizarre part was that, no matter how much I tidied up, when I left and returned, the door would always be closed, just as it had been when I arrived. The odd part was that I never remembered hearing it close. It was as though it closed on its own, without a sound. Each time, the inexplicable feeling of being watched crept over me, leaving me more unsettled. Then, one night, everything changed. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest, only to find Daniel standing at the foot of the bed. His back was to me, rigid and unmoving. I didn't even need to ask what was going on. I knew something was terribly wrong. "Daniel," called out softly, my voice barely a whisper, fearing to break the silence. But he didn't respond. I sat up quickly, my pulse racing in my throat. "Daniel, what's going on?" There was no immediate response. Instead, he turned slowly, deliberately, to face me. His eyes were wide open, but they were empty, devoid of any emotion or recognition. The life that had once flickered in them was gone, replaced by a hollow, lifeless gaze. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice soft, almost pleading. There was a strange, unnatural quality to his words that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My body stiffened, unsure of what to say, what to do. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I couldn't deny it any longer. The sense of dread was overwhelming. The following days were filled with a growing sense of urgency. I knew I needed to talk to Miriam about what was happening, but I didn't know how to broach the subject. When I finally did, she listened intently, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with concern. After a long pause, she spoke quietly. "I've noticed it too," she confessed, her voice tinged with fear. "Daniel's been different lately, but I don't know what to do." I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had taken root in my heart. We were both at a loss. That night, after everything that had happened, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in Daniel's room again. The air in that room had become too thick with unease, too heavy with whatever had changed in him. So, I made a decision. I would move my mattress to the living room. I dragged it across the floor, the sound of the mattress scraping against the wood echoing through the house. Every step I took felt wrong, like I was walking toward something I couldn't escape. Miriam saw me, but said nothing. She merely nodded as if she understood. Her silent acknowledgement was strangely comforting, as if she had seen things too, things she couldn't explain. From that night on, I never returned to Daniel's room. no matter how hard I tried to push away the memory of those cold, lifeless eyes. I couldn't forget them. I couldn't forget the way he had looked at me, the sense that he was no longer the same person. I kept my mattress in the living room, where it felt safer, though the comfort was fleeting. The nights were quieter, yes, but there was always that lingering presence, that feeling that something or someone was still near. Daniel didn't stop visiting me, though. He still came, but it was never the same. He no longer spoke. There were no more whispers, no more soft pleas. Instead, his presence filled the room with an oppressive weight, thick and heavy. I could always tell when he was near, even before I saw him. His footsteps echoed in my mind long after he had disappeared, a haunting reminder of his presence. I never saw him fully. I only caught glimpses, flashes of movement at the edge of my vision, but his presence was undeniable, like a shadow that never left my side. I could never tell if he was really there or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Was I imagining it? Perhaps. But sometimes, when I lay alone in the living room, the air would grow colder, and I would feel the unmistakable sensation of someone, or something, standing right behind me. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling never went away. It lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that something had changed, something I couldn't explain. I never stayed long enough to figure it out. I didn't want to. Some things are better left unexplained. Some questions are better left unasked. Some rooms are better left alone. And so, I kept my mattress in the living room, where I could at least pretend that I was safe. The nights were quieter now, but every so often, when the house was still, and I was alone in the dark, I could feel his presence in the shadows. I didn't know if he would ever leave completely, but I wasn't ready to find out. Thank you for taking the time to watch our videos. If you find the content useful and interesting, don't forget to like, share, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Our channel will always update attractive, inspiring and useful content for you. Click the bell icon to receive notifications as soon as there are new videos. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue to develop. Thank you and see you in the next videos.